Have you ever witnessed a miracle in the making? In the stillness of the ICU, a nurse named Nina stands by a comatose patient, a woman far too young to be trapped in silence. For weeks, she's shown no sign of life, until tonight. A single tear, slipping slowly down Sarah's cheek, ignites a spark. Is it a reflex or a silent scream for help? As days turn into nights, Nina refuses to give up. She pushes boundaries, tests limits, and plays the melodies of Sarah's past, hoping to find the key to unlocking her consciousness. And then, a flicker. A twitch. A squeeze of a hand. Was it all in Nina's imagination, or is Sarah trying to come back from the darkness? The clock's gentle ticking seemed almost to breathe with the rhythm of the ICU. It was as if the sound synchronized with the ventilator's steady hum and the soft beeping of monitors that filled the air. Nina moved with a deliberate quietness, her rubber-soled shoes barely making a sound on the polished linoleum. This was her domain, a place where shadows stretched long in the dim lighting, where the night seemed endless and time played tricks on the mind. 15 years as a nurse had taught Nina many things: the signs of fatigue in a patient, the differences in breaths that spoke volumes, and the weariness that sometimes crept into her bones. Yet, she had never lost her sense of intuition, her sharp instincts that went beyond the textbooks. Tonight, however, there was a different energy in the air, an almost imperceptible shift that set her senses on alert. Room 302 seemed to call her name. She felt a faint tug in her chest, an inexplicable pull that urged her forward. She paused at the door, glancing inside. Sarah lay still, almost ethereal against the backdrop of white sheets. Her hair, a cascade of soft brown waves, framed her face like a halo. At only 32, Sarah was far too young to be trapped in this purgatory of machines and monitors. She had been like this for weeks, the victim of a car accident on a rain-soaked road, a moment's misfortune that had cast her into this indefinite sleep. Nina's gaze moved to Sarah's face, and that's when she saw it, a tear, clear as glass, slipping slowly down Sarah's cheek. The sight stopped Nina in her tracks. Her breath hitched, a slight tremor running through her fingers. Could it be? She leaned in closer, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement, anything that might explain this anomaly. The tear continued its path, glistening under the sterile light, until it paused at the corner of Sarah's mouth. She glanced around the room, half expecting another nurse or a technician to share in her astonishment. But the room remained still, a quiet cocoon of machinery and shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest, a sudden surge of adrenaline rushing through her veins. She wanted to reach out, to wipe the tear away, but something held her back, a whisper of intuition that told her to wait. "Sarah, can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and disbelief. There was no reply, no flicker of recognition, just the steady rise and fall of Sarah's chest, each breath drawn in by the ventilator. Nina's rational mind argued that it could be a reflex, a muscle twitch, or perhaps even a trick of the light. But deep down, something felt different. The tear seemed deliberate, as if Sarah were trying to communicate in the only way she could. Was it possible? Her fingers hovered over the call button. Dr. Matthews would still be in his office, poring over charts. He was compassionate but also pragmatic, likely to dismiss her observation as an involuntary action, a simple reflex. And yet, Nina felt an urgency she couldn't explain, a need to stay. She pulled up a chair, her movements slow and careful, as if afraid of disturbing the delicate balance of the moment. She took Sarah's hand, feeling the coolness of her skin. "If you can hear me, Sarah, just give me a sign," she whispered, her voice gentle yet insistent. Minutes slipped by, each one a small eternity. The tear dried, leaving only a faint, salty trail on Sarah's skin. Doubt began to creep in, a familiar companion on these long night shifts. Was she reading too much into this? Imagining things in her exhaustion? But then, she remembered why she had become a nurse, to listen to what wasn't being said, to see beyond the obvious. "I'm not going anywhere," Nina murmured, her resolve strengthening. "I'm here. I'll be here as long as you need me." She began to speak, her words flowing like a stream, sharing stories of the hospital, of patients who had found their way back from the brink, of small miracles she had witnessed over the years. She talked about her childhood, the smell of her mother's kitchen, the sound of her father's laughter. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to speak, but it felt right, like she was bridging a gap, sending a lifeline out to Sarah in the darkness. The clock on the wall showed that an hour had passed, though it felt like mere minutes. Nina sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. "I need to check on the others," she said softly, reluctant to leave. "But I'll be back. I promise." She stood up, releasing Sarah's hand slowly, her fingers lingering for just a moment longer. As she turned to leave, she heard it, a soft sigh, so faint she almost missed it. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Turning back, she stared at Sarah's face, looking for any sign, any movement. Her face was still, eyes closed, but Nina could have sworn she saw the corner of Sarah's mouth twitch. A rush of determination surged through her. She stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "Sarah, if you can hear me, do it again," she pleaded, her voice firm but gentle. She waited, holding her breath, but there was nothing, just the rhythmic sound of the ventilator, the steady beat of the heart monitor. She leaned back, disappointment mingling with hope. Maybe it had been her imagination, a trick of the dim light and her tired mind. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something vital. Before leaving, she looked back one last time. "I'll be back, Sarah," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I'm not giving up on you." As she walked down the hallway, the tears still vivid in her memory, she felt a deep determination settle within her. She didn't know what had happened tonight, but she knew one thing: she had to keep believing. She had to keep trying to reach Sarah, in whatever way she could. The first light of dawn was just beginning to spill across the city as Nina found herself once more standing outside room 302. The tear on Sarah's cheek had haunted her thoughts throughout the night. Even after her shift ended, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something extraordinary, something beyond the ordinary reflexes and twitches of comatose patients. She had spent the early morning hours replaying the scene in her mind, wondering if she had imagined it, if exhaustion had clouded her judgment. But deep down, she knew better. The nurse's station was beginning to stir with the sounds of the day shift arriving. Nina absently flipped through Sarah's patient chart, her eyes skimming over the familiar notations. No response to stimuli, condition stable, comatose state continues. The words felt flat, devoid of the spark she had seen the night before. How could a tear fall from a lifeless body? How could something so small feel like it held the weight of the world? With a sigh, Nina closed the chart. She knew she needed more than clinical notes to understand what was happening. She needed to connect with Sarah, to bridge the chasm between them. She moved through the ICU with purpose, her mind focused on one thing: finding a way to reach Sarah. As she pushed open the door to room 302, the light was softer, more welcoming in the early hours. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the walls and floor. Sarah lay in the same stillness as before, her face serene, her chest rising and falling in that steady, mechanical rhythm. But to Nina, something was different. The air felt charged with a kind of energy, a subtle change that set her heart racing. Nina moved closer, her footsteps quiet against the cold, hard floor. She stood beside the bed, looking down at Sarah's face. "Good morning, Sarah," she said softly, her voice gentle yet filled with determination. "It's Nina again. I promised I'd be back, didn't I?" She waited for a moment, half expecting some miraculous response, a flutter of eyelids, a twitch of fingers. But there was nothing. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the silence in the room seemed almost oppressive. Nina felt the familiar creep of doubt, the small voice in the back of her mind whispering that she was fooling herself, that she was grasping at straws. But she pushed the thought away, refusing to let go of the hope she felt. Pulling up a chair, she sat down next to the bed. "I've been thinking about you a lot," she continued, her voice filling the stillness. "Wondering who you are, what kind of life you had before all this. I talked to your mom yesterday. She told me you love music. That you used to play the piano. Do you remember that, Sarah? Nina watched Sarah's face intently, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that her words were reaching the woman lying so still and silent before her. But there was nothing. Just the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the soft whoosh of the ventilator. She swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. Was she making a fool of herself? Was this all for nothing? She decided to change tactics. Your mom also mentioned how you love the outdoors, Nina said, leaning forward slightly. She told me about the hikes you used to take, how you'd always be the first one to reach the top of the hill, laughing and urging everyone to keep up. She smiled at the image, hoping it might spark something in Sarah's memory. You must have been quite the adventurer. Still, there was no response. Nina felt a wave of frustration but refused to give in. She continued, her voice a steady murmur, sharing bits of her own life, small stories and anecdotes. She talked about her childhood, about her first bike ride, the time she fell off and scraped her knee, how her mother had comforted her with cookies and warm milk. She talked about the scent of fresh coffee in the morning, the sound of rain on the roof at night, the things that had shaped her, hoping that somehow, some way, these little fragments of life might pierce the veil of silence that enveloped Sarah. Minutes turned into an hour, but Nina kept going, driven by a quiet determination. She felt like a sailor lost at sea, casting out words like flares, hoping one would find its mark in the dark. She spoke about the other patients in the ICU, the small victories and heartbreaks, the daily fight that defined their existence. She described the world outside the hospital walls, the flowers that were just beginning to bloom in the garden, the children she could hear laughing in the park nearby. She filled the room with words, with life, trying to reach Sarah, trying to bring her back from wherever she was. Finally, her throat dry and her voice hoarse, Nina paused. She glanced at the clock. Another hour had passed, though it felt like mere minutes. She sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and hope. Okay, Sarah, she said, her voice stronger now, I'm going to go check on the others, but I'll be back. I promise. As she stood up to leave, she heard a soft knock at the door. Dr. Matthews stood there, holding a cup of coffee, a slight smile on his lips, though there was concern in his eyes. Morning, Nina, he said, stepping into the room. You're here early again. Nina returned his smile, though hers was more tentative. Yeah, I wanted to check on her, she replied, trying to gauge his reaction. I noticed something last night, a tear, and I thought. Dr. Matthews raised a hand gently, a gesture meant to reassure but also to interrupt. A tear? He asked, his tone measured. Nina, you know those things can happen. Reflex actions, sometimes even the air in the room can cause them. I know you care about your patients, but you've got to be careful not to read too much into things. Nina felt a flush of frustration rise in her cheeks. I know, but it felt different. I can't explain it, but it was like she was trying to tell us something. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. I understand, he said finally, his voice gentler now. We've all been in your shoes, hoping for a sign, looking for something that tells us they're still in there. But sometimes, it's just not that simple. Nina nodded, but her heart wasn't in it. I feel like I need to try. To reach her somehow, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Dr. Matthews took a sip of his coffee and nodded slowly. All right, he said, but don't let it consume you. Keep doing your job, keep your focus. And remember, it's okay to care, but it's also okay to accept that some things are out of our hands. Nina smiled, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I know, doctor. Thanks. As he left the room, Nina stood by the bed, her mind racing. She knew he was right, of course, but something in her gut told her she was right too. She decided she needed to learn more about Sarah, to find out who this woman was, what she loved, what mattered to her. Maybe then she'd find a way to reach her. That afternoon, Nina found Sarah's mother sitting in the waiting room, her eyes tired but hopeful. Mrs. Andrews? Nina began, her voice gentle. The older woman looked up, surprised but glad to see her. Oh, hello, Nina. Is everything okay? Nina nodded, pulling up a chair beside her. I wanted to ask you a few things about Sarah, she said. I'm trying to connect with her, in case she can hear us. Mrs. Andrews' face softened, and she nodded. Of course, she replied. What would you like to know? Nina leaned in, curiosity in her eyes. Tell me about her life, the things she loved. What made her smile? Mrs. Andrews began to talk, her voice thick with emotion. She spoke of Sarah's childhood, her love for animals, her passion for music. She loved to play the piano, Mrs. Andrews said, her eyes distant with memory. She would play for hours, just lose herself in the keys. There was a song she loved, a lullaby my mother used to sing to her. I think she even played it the night before the accident. Nina felt a spark ignite in her. Do you remember the song? She asked, her voice eager. Mrs. Andrews nodded. Yes, I do. I can sing it for you, if that would help. Nina's heart swelled with hope. That would be wonderful, she replied. Maybe it'll reach her somehow. That night, as the ward quieted down again, Nina sat by Sarah's bedside and began to sing, softly, the lullaby that Sarah's mother had taught her. Her voice was low, filled with a tenderness that carried through the quiet room. She watched Sarah's face intently, looking for any sign, any flicker of recognition. And then, just for a moment, she thought she saw it, the faintest twitch at the corner of Sarah's mouth. Her breath caught, her heart quickened. Was it a reflex, a coincidence, or was Sarah reaching out, a soul adrift in the darkness, trying to find her way back? Nina didn't know. But she knew one thing for sure, she wouldn't stop. Not yet. She would keep singing, keep talking, keep trying. Because sometimes, a small, unexplainable sign was enough to keep hope alive. Nina's days began to blur into a singular focus, each shift merging with the next as her thoughts kept drifting back to room 302. The other nurses noticed her growing attachment to Sarah, their knowing looks and quiet murmurs didn't go unnoticed. Yet Nina felt an unexplainable pull, a magnetic force that drew her back to Sarah's side time and time again. It was as if Sarah were a mystery that needed unraveling. A life paused in mid-motion, like a book left open to a page that no one had yet read. Every time Nina sat beside her, she felt as though she was peering into the unknown, hoping for some sign, some clue that would reveal the woman Sarah had been before the accident. Her determination only grew stronger after hearing Sarah's mother sing that lullaby, the lullaby that seemed to spark a flicker of life, however faint. One afternoon, while on a brief break, Nina found herself in the hospital's small library, searching for information. She needed to know more about how music, smells, or even stories could reach someone in a coma. She flipped through medical journals and books, reading about sensory stimulation therapy and the brain's ability to recognize familiar patterns even in a state of unconsciousness. The idea took root in her mind. Perhaps the key to reaching Sarah was in awakening those memories, those parts of her that still resonated deeply. She decided to dig deeper, to learn not just about Sarah's condition, but about her life. The medical notes on her chart were too clinical, too devoid of the essence of the person who lay in that bed. Nina needed to fill in those gaps, to understand what made Sarah smile, what made her heart race, what gave her peace. Maybe then she could find the right way to bring her back. That evening, after her shift, she invited Sarah's mother, Mrs. Andrews, to a nearby coffee shop. The warm, comforting smell of roasted beans filled the air, and the quiet hum of conversation created a soothing backdrop. Mrs. Andrews sat across from her, looking tired but hopeful, her hands tightly wrapped around a cup of tea. Thank you for coming, Nina began, her voice sincere. I know it must be difficult to talk about all this, but I feel like we might be missing something that could help Sarah. Mrs. Andrews nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. I appreciate what you're doing, Nina. You're one of the few who still seem to have hope. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just holding on to something that isn't there. Nina leaned in, her expression earnest. I don't think it's foolish at all, she replied. I've seen a lot in my years as a nurse, and sometimes the smallest signs mean everything. That terror, it was real. I'm convinced she's still there, fighting to come back to us. Mrs. Andrews seemed to ponder this for a moment, her eyes distant. Sarah was always a fighter, she murmured, almost to herself. Even as a child. She was so full of life. She loved music, yes, but there was so much more to her. She always believed in the impossible, believed in people, in goodness, even when others didn't. Nina's interest piqued. Can you tell me more about that? She urged gently. What did she believe in? What made her so hopeful? The older woman's smile grew a bit wider, a glint of warmth returning to her eyes. She always saw the best in people, Mrs. Andrews said softly. She believed that everyone had a light inside them, even when it was hidden. She volunteered at shelters, organized community events. She was always trying to make the world a little brighter. Nina felt a connection forming, a deeper understanding of the woman lying in room 302. Maybe that's what she needs, she said thoughtfully. A reminder of what made her feel alive, what she loved most. Mrs. Andrews nodded. That could be true. She was always so passionate about music, about helping people. I remember one time, she paused, a distant look in her eyes. She organized a charity concert to raise money for a local shelter. She spent months planning it, and when the day came, she was so nervous. But the moment she stepped on stage and started playing, it was like she was transformed. She was radiant, so full of energy. Nina felt a spark ignite inside her. A concert, she repeated, almost to herself. Do you think music might help? I've been playing some songs, but maybe there's something more specific. Mrs. Andrews' face softened, and she nodded. There was a piece she loved, Clair de Lune by Debussy. It was her go-to whenever she needed comfort or clarity. She used to say it made her feel like she could fly. Nina's heart quickened. I think I can find a recording of that, or even play it for her somehow. It's worth a try, right? Mrs. Andrews smiled, a tear glistening in her eye. Yes, she whispered. Anything is worth a try. I just want to see her smile again, to know she's still in there somewhere. That evening, after a long day tending to her other patients, Nina returned to Sarah's room with a small portable speaker. She had found a beautiful recording of Clair de Lune, the kind that seemed to flow like water, gentle yet powerful. She placed the speaker on the bedside table, took a deep breath, and pressed play. The first notes floated into the room, soft and ethereal, each one hanging in the air like a promise. Nina watched Sarah's face carefully, searching for any sign, any hint of recognition. She spoke softly as the music played. This is for you, Sarah. I hope you can hear it. I hope it brings you some peace. The melody danced through the room, wrapping itself around them like a warm blanket on a cold night. Nina could feel herself relaxing, being carried away by the beauty of the music, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the emotion in every note. When she opened her eyes again, she saw it, a flutter, so slight she almost missed it, a tiny movement of Sarah's eyelids. Her breath caught in her throat. Sarah, she whispered, leaning in closer. Can you hear it? Can you feel it? She waited, each second stretching into an eternity. And then, just as she was about to lose hope, she saw it again, another twitch, a slight turn of Sarah's head. Nina felt a rush of adrenaline, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. Was it really happening? Was she finally breaking through? Nina stayed there, sitting quietly by Sarah's side, the music playing softly in the background, her heart filled with hope. She didn't know if it was a reflex or if Sarah was truly reaching out from the depths of her coma. But she knew one thing, she would keep trying, keep pushing, keep believing. Because for Sarah, and for herself, hope was the one thing she could not afford to lose. Days turned into a blur as Nina's dedication to Sarah grew more intense. Her world outside the hospital seemed to shrink, every moment defined by the small, dimly lit space of room 302. She felt a fragile connection building through the music, the stories, and the quiet moments shared in the stillness of the ICU. Yet, as the days wore on, a sense of urgency settled over her, pressing down like a storm cloud about to burst. Nina knew she couldn't keep this up forever. The hospital had its own rhythms, its own demands, and she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, their concern growing. One morning, as she was filling out charts at the nurses' station, she overheard a hushed conversation between two other nurses, their voices low but clear. "She's spending a lot of time in there," one of them whispered, glancing over at Nina with a mix of curiosity and worry. "I know," replied the other, even quieter. "I think she's getting too attached. It's not good, for her or the patient." Nina pretended not to hear, but their words cut deeper than she expected. She had been here before, straddling the fine line between empathy and attachment, but this time felt different. She had never felt so certain, so driven by an instinct she couldn't fully explain. Yet she also knew that the hospital board would soon start questioning the costs of keeping Sarah in the ICU, and that thought filled her with dread. If Sarah was moved to long-term care, the opportunities for sensory therapy and close monitoring would diminish significantly. Later that day, she found herself standing outside Dr. Matthews' office, nerves twisting in her stomach. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and knocked on the door. "Come in," came his familiar voice from inside. Nina opened the door to find Dr. Matthews at his desk, a stack of files spread out before him. He looked up, his brow furrowed with surprise. "Nina," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to talk to you about Sarah," she began, her tone urgent but controlled. Dr. Matthews' expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained guarded. "I thought as much," he replied. "Go on." "I've been spending a lot of time with her," Nina explained, trying to connect in different ways, to see if there's any response. "I played her favorite piece, Claire de Lune, and I've seen signs, small ones, but I believe they're real." Dr. Matthews leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "Signs," he repeated, his voice a mix of curiosity and caution. "Yes," Nina continued, a note of hope creeping into her voice. Her eyelids fluttered when the music played. She moved her hand slightly when I spoke to her. "I know it sounds minor, but I truly believe she's still there, somewhere." Dr. Matthews sighed, rubbing his temples. "Nina, I understand how much you care," he said softly, "but you know as well as I do that those kinds of movements can be involuntary, reflexive. I don't want you to get your hopes up too high." Nina felt a wave of frustration but kept her voice steady. "I'm aware of that, doctor. But what if it's not just reflex? What if there's something more happening here, something we're not seeing?" He studied her for a long moment. "What are you suggesting?" he asked finally. "I think we should try something different," Nina said, leaning in slightly. "Sensory stimulation therapy, sounds, smells, touches, anything that might trigger a memory or a response. I've already started with the music, but I think we can do more." Dr. Matthews nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Sensory stimulation," he repeated. "It's unconventional, but not without merit." "Exactly," Nina replied, her eyes bright with determination. "We don't have much to lose, and if there's even a small chance it could help." Dr. Matthews tapped his fingers on the desk, considering. "All right," he said at last. "But on one condition, you document everything. Every response, every detail. We need to be objective, to ensure we're not seeing only what we want to see." Nina smiled, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "I promise I'll keep meticulous notes. I just want to give her a chance." Dr. Matthews returned her smile, though his remained cautious. "Just remember, Nina," he said gently, "not every story has a happy ending. Be prepared for that possibility, too." That evening, Nina returned to room 302 with a renewed sense of purpose. She carried a small bag filled with various items, a piece of soft fabric, a vial of lavender oil, a photo album that Mrs. Andrews had provided, and other objects she thought might evoke a response. She began with the fabric, brushing it against Sarah's arm, her movements slow and deliberate. "This is soft, isn't it, Sarah?" she murmured. "Do you remember how this feels?" Next, she uncapped the lavender oil and held it near Sarah's nose. "Breathe it in, Sarah, it's lavender, like the fields we used to pass on the way to school," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Do you remember?" Nina watched closely, searching for any change, any flicker. Nothing yet. But she wasn't deterred. She picked up the photo album, flipping through its pages slowly. "Your mom brought this for you," she said softly. "Look, here's a picture of you as a child, playing with your dog, and here, on your graduation day. Do these moments mean anything to you, Sarah?" She held her breath, waiting. And then she saw it, a tiny movement, a flutter of Sarah's eyelids. Her heart leapt into her throat. "Sarah," she whispered, leaning closer. "If you can see it, if you can hear me, do something. Give me a sign." She waited, the tension in the room almost palpable. Seconds stretched on like hours. Finally, a small twitch of Sarah's hand. Nina felt a rush of excitement, her pulse racing. She had to be sure. "Sarah, if you can hear me, move your fingers again," she pleaded, her voice trembling. And there it was, another slight, deliberate movement, just enough to send a surge of joy through Nina's veins. She pressed the call button quickly, but something made her pause before calling the others. She needed to be certain. She continued to speak, her voice calm and steady, telling Sarah about the day, the way the light filtered through the windows, the aroma of fresh coffee that lingered in the corridors, the small garden outside that was beginning to bloom. She filled the room with her presence, with her warmth. Minutes passed, and then she felt it again, a faint pressure around her hand. Sarah's fingers moved, tightening ever so slightly around her own. Nina's breath caught, tears welling up in her eyes. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "If you can hear me, squeeze my hand again." She waited, her heart pounding, and then felt it, a gentle, unmistakable squeeze. The door swung open, and another nurse rushed in, followed by Dr. Matthews. He looked between Nina and Sarah, his expression shifting from concern to astonishment. "What's happening?" he asked. Nina, tears streaming down her face, whispered, "She's there, doctor. She's trying to come back to us." Dr. Matthews approached the bed, his skepticism melting into cautious hope. "Sarah," he said softly, leaning in. "If you can hear us, try again. Just once more." They waited, breathless, and then, slowly, Sarah's fingers moved again. Nina's heart soared. She knew the road ahead would be long, full of uncertainty, but in that moment, she felt a deep, unwavering belief that somehow, against all odds, they were going to find their way through the darkness. The days following the breakthrough were filled with cautious hope and a renewed sense of purpose. Word of Sarah's movement spread quickly through the hospital, turning into a beacon of conversation and speculation. Some saw it as a sign, a flicker of life in the sea of doubt, others, as a simple reflex, a last gesture from an unconscious body. But to Nina, it was a sign, the signal she had been waiting for. Nina's commitment to Sarah only deepened after that. She continued with the sensory stimulation therapy, introducing new elements daily, different kinds of music, the scent of Sarah's favorite perfume, recordings of her family's voices. She meticulously documented every response, just as Dr. Matthews had instructed. Her notes were detailed, filled with observations, but also her own hopes and fears. Every evening, as the ward began to quiet, Nina would return to room 302. She spoke softly to Sarah, recounting the events of the day, the little victories and struggles, always mindful to include details that might stir something within. She read aloud from Sarah's favorite books, played more of her beloved songs, and brought in small objects, a seashell from a family vacation, a photograph from her childhood. Hey, Sarah, she began one evening, her voice calm and steady as she took a seat beside the bed. I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Nina. I've been here with you for a while now. I just wanted to tell you, you're doing great. You're stronger than any of us knew. Sarah's eyes remained closed, her face still, but Nina could have sworn there was a softness in her expression, a peace that hadn't been there before. She continued talking, telling Sarah about the flowers blooming outside the hospital, the way the sunlight danced on the water of the small pond. She spoke of mundane things and extraordinary things, all the while hoping for another sign. She took Sarah's hand in hers again, feeling its coolness, remembering the slight squeeze from just days before. I need you to do something for me, she whispered, leaning in close. If you're there, if you can hear me, just move your fingers, even a little bit. Show me you're still fighting. The silence was heavy, almost unbearable. Then, slowly, Sarah's fingers twitched against her palm. Nina's heart skipped a beat. That's it, she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. You're doing it, Sarah. I'm right here with you. Over the next week, the signs became clearer. Sarah's eyelids fluttered more often, her fingers moved more deliberately, and there were even faint attempts to move her lips, as if trying to form words. Dr. Matthews and the other doctors began to take more notice, adjusting her treatments, discussing new possibilities that had seemed far-fetched just days before. However, with these signs of progress came growing pressure. The hospital board began to scrutinize the costs of keeping Sarah in the ICU. Conversations about transferring her to long-term care grew more frequent, and Nina knew what that would mean: fewer chances for stimulation, less interaction, and potentially losing the fragile progress they had made. One afternoon, Nina found herself in Dr. Matthews' office again. This time, she felt more urgency, more conviction. She's showing signs, Nina insisted, her voice firm. We can't move her now. We're so close to something. Dr. Matthews sighed, his face tired but understanding. I agree with you, Nina, but the board has its regulations. They're looking at data, at cost efficiency, they don't see what we see. Nina leaned forward, her eyes fierce. Then let's show them. Let's give them something they can't ignore. He studied her for a moment, admiration mixed with caution. What do you propose? He asked quietly. Let's get her family involved, Nina said, her mind racing. They're her best connection to her past, to the life she had. Let them come in, talk to her, play her favorite music, tell stories. If there's even a chance she's in there, she'll respond to them. Dr. Matthews nodded slowly, considering. It's worth a try, he agreed. But we need to act fast. The board meets again in a few days. The next morning, Sarah's room was filled with the soft murmur of voices, a stark contrast to the usual quiet. Her mother was there, along with her father and younger brother, Tom. They took turns speaking to her, their voices rich with love and hope. Tom sat beside her bed, holding her hand, recounting stories of their childhood, their shared adventures, and his belief in her strength. You remember that, Sarah? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. You were always the brave one, always pushing me to go further. You're still that person. I know you are. Nina stood by the door, her heart pounding, watching, waiting. This was the moment of truth. If Sarah could just give one more sign. Then it happened. Sarah's eyelids fluttered open, just for a second. Mrs. Andrews gasped, tears immediately welling in her eyes. Sarah, she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Nina felt her breath catch. Sarah, can you hear them? She asked softly, moving closer. Your family is here. If you can hear them, try to move your hand again. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Then, slowly, Sarah's hand tightened around her brother's fingers. It wasn't strong, but it was deliberate. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by quiet sobs of relief and joy. Dr. Matthews stepped forward, his face a mix of disbelief and excitement. Sarah, can you open your eyes again? he asked gently. "We're right here with you. Just try, just a little." Sarah's eyelids fluttered once more, this time staying open a second longer, her gaze unfocused but searching. Her mother reached out, touching her cheek, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "we're here. We've been waiting for you." Nina felt tears spilling over, her heart swelling with emotion. She knew the journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but for now, there was hope, real, undeniable hope. As she left the room that day, a sense of peace settled over her. In a world filled with so much uncertainty, she had found something solid, something to hold on to. She believed now, more than ever, that even in the darkest times, a single tear could light the way back to life.